So we've come upon the last topic I've decided to explore with y'all in this class. What did we do in this class? Well, one of the first things that we did is we looked at a bunch of different ethical theories as to what makes something moral or immoral, right? I gave you a bunch of perspectives or lenses, you might say, with which to analyze actions. We looked at deontology, utilitarianism, virtue theory, the ethics of care. We looked at some meta-ethical views. So these were like meta views that tried to explain what it is that we're doing when we're uttering moral sentences or making moral claims. Then we have tried to apply those ethical theories to various issues, right? We looked at circumcision, recreational drug use, prostitution. We tried to look at these things and see, can they be defended morally? Are they morally permissible, impermissible? What's going on here? In this last unit, we've been focused on taking kind of a big picture, a bird's eye view of ethics as a whole. What we've been investigating are problems for living out a good moral life, right? Things that might threaten to undermine ethical behavior, the field of ethics as a whole, like perhaps the idea that we don't have free will, or that our actions are determined, things like that. One thing that we haven't touched on yet is what we should do if we end up violating some of those ethical theories that we hold dear, or those moral principles that we're trying to live by. And what should we do if somebody does something immoral to us? How should we feel about that? How should we respond as individuals? How should we respond as members of a society in which, well, we're all kind of in this together and we're stuck with one another to some degree and we got to get stuff done? We're going to be investigating just that today. And to do that, I asked you to read an excerpt from a book titled The Human Condition by political theorist Hannah Arendt. And it is in this book that Arendt is doing a number of things, but what is germane to this class is her investigation of what is perhaps necessary for us to continue to live and thrive as members of a society who are in relationship with one another. Hannah Arendt was a very important 20th century political theorist who wrote on a wide range of topics from education to political authority to totalitarianism. You might be aware of her books, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Revolution, The Life of the Mind. She's somebody who wrote on a wide range of political, social, and ethical issues. She was a German-born Jewish historian and philosopher who ended up coming eventually to America before the breaking out of World War II. As somebody who lived in Germany for a long time, she saw, well, the rise of Nazism there and the changing social and political landscape. And so this is something that deeply informs her political views and gives her some insight as to maybe how we should organize ourselves as members of a society and what is going to be required in order for us in our day and age to, well, not ruin everything and blow ourselves up. The reason why we're looking at her in this class is because in her book, The Human Condition, she offers a really sober analysis of where we are in our modern age. And it's going to be relevant to ethics because the kinds of analysis that she provides is going to give us some insight into how we should respond to those who break ethical norms, who violate ethical principles, who do us or our family members wrong. It's important to realize that the philosophy that we're going to be looking at today is informed deeply by Arendt's lived experiences as a Jew who fled from Germany during the rise of Nazism. So during this time in human history, she saw a lot of persecution and prejudice and the rising of authoritarianism around her. So when we talk later about her prescriptions, her recommendations for how we ought to treat others when they make mistakes, just keep this in the back of your mind. Arendt was somebody who witnessed terrible things, a lot of persecution and prejudice that likely we do not have to go through, that we have not witnessed in our own lives. In this book more specifically, which I actually wrote my master's thesis on, I wrote it on one sentence in this book, she's trying to basically describe where we are at as human beings in our modern age. What is our condition? What is our society like? How is politics going? How has politics, thought, philosophy, human practice evolved since the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans? How have the natural sciences impacted the development of our society? What have they given to us? What have they allowed us to do? All of this stuff is relevant to the analysis that she's trying to provide. In other words, what she's trying to describe for us is, due to the conflux of these forces and historical events, what we are doing and what we need to be wary of due to our technological advancements and due to the way that we've organized production and consumption in Western society. The overarching theme of her book is basically this: several forces, historical events, changing human perceptions and behaviors and norms have landed us in a precarious position, politically, morally, technologically. Another way of putting this is, in light of mass production and consumption, the tremendous powers that we're able to wield due to science, due to our technological innovation, due to the way that we've organized things and the capital and the wealth that we've been able to generate, due to the creation of the atomic bomb, we are in a precarious position. And so she asks in this book, in light of all of this stuff, in light of where we are, in light of the fact that now we have the ability to completely wipe ourselves and everything else off the planet if we wanted to, where do we go from here? How do we handle this stuff? How do we wield it in a just and wise fashion? Is that possible, or are we doomed? What tools are going to be necessary in order to see us through this difficult time in human history? How can we avoid destroying ourselves? How can we continue to progress morally, politically, and continue to thrive How can we make human life better in light of all this? This is basically what she's trying to analyze in the book. So she's doing something very difficult, complex. If you do decide to pick up this book, which I would highly recommend, the writing style is very difficult and confusing, but extremely rewarding if you can understand what she's trying to get at and what she's trying to say. To connect this to this class more specifically, the reason why we are looking at this last is because Arendt's answer to this question has a direct bearing on everything that we've been talking about up until this point. And hopefully that will become clear as we go through the rest of this lecture today. So today I asked you to read, I believe, just 3 chapters, you might even just call them sections because they're not very long, of this book, The Human Condition. What Arendt is doing in these chapters is she is describing the capacities of human beings, how those capacities have influenced the development and evolution of our society, and thus what is going to be necessary, the kinds of tools and practices that we should be engaging in order to make sure that we don't fuck everything up for ourselves in future generations. We start with section 32, the process character of action. In this section, Arendt claims that each person has the innate capacity to bring something new into the world, or to initiate a process through what she calls action. This is not a very complex idea. Basically, it's as a human being who has the consciousness that you do, the outlook, the abilities, the cognitive machinery that you do, you can do some pretty awesome stuff. You can create things, right? You can create a new piece of music, a new song. You can create a new work of art. You can write a poem that has never been written. This capacity to create, to bring something new into existence is what she calls action. And this is an innate capacity in all human beings. The problem with this is that such a capacity is very powerful. Think of how much you can change the world by writing a song that becomes a hit song. Think of how much you can influence people's perceptions and behaviors by creating a certain work of art. But more than this, think of the way that you can impact the world just by doing something very small that ends up cascading and multiplying into consequences down the line. So it doesn't seem like this is really worth much or that it's very powerful, but what Arendt is trying to describe in this section is that basically, we have abilities to begin processes that we cannot completely understand, foresee, predict, or control. And so knowing that, we should be very cautious and cognizant about how we act, the things that we bring into this world, and the consequences that we bring about through our speech, through our actions. The fact of the matter is, action produces consequences. Consequences which we cannot ever completely understand or predict or know or control. These consequences, to sum up, are unpredictable and irreversible. And they multiply as time goes on. Think about some small action that you just did the other day. Try to imagine how that impacted the world at the time that you did it and how it's going to impact people in the future. You decided to help somebody out by picking up their books for them, right? A very simple thing, a very simple action. Well, that action had some sort of impact on the person you were helping, right? On their mood. In some subtle way, that's going to influence how they act the rest of the day. As they act, they're going to interact with other people, right? That they're in relationship with or just acquaintances. And their actions are going to impact those people. And those people's actions are going to impact more people. So you see how a simple action can multiply into these unforeseen consequences that shape the world in these strange and unpredictable ways? Think about the natural sciences. Think about how the creation or the invention of some sort of mathematical notation or scientific theory has now resulted in these technological advancements which are changing the world all around them. Right? So, through our actions, although we cannot always see it, although it's not always known to us, we can impact the world and others around us very deeply and very profoundly. It's as if every action that we commit produces a chain of dominoes that continues to fall down long into the future. This is how we should understand just even those little things that we are doing in our daily lives that are going to have subtle impacts on those around us, our professors, our friends, our family members, and our strangers through our consumer decisions, our educational decisions, whatever it may be. Here's what Arendt has to say about this nature of action. Whereas men have always been capable of destroying whatever was the product of human hands, and have become capable today even of the potential destruction of what man did not make, the earth and the earthly nature. Here she's talking about the atomic bomb, right? We didn't create nature. We didn't create all the animals and the bacteria and the plants, but now we have the ability to blow it all up if we wanted. Men never have been and never will be able to undo or even to control reliably any of the processes they start through action. Not even oblivion and confusion, which can cover up so efficiently the origin and responsibility for every single deed, are unable to undo a deed or prevent its consequences. And this incapacity to undo what has been done is matched by an almost equally complete incapacity to foretell the consequences of deed, or even to have reliable knowledge of its motives. When you utter a word to somebody, you can't take that word back, right? You can apologize for it, you can try to smooth it over, but you can't take it back, right? You can't make it as if you never uttered it. The same thing is true of action. Once you do something in the world, you can't undo that. It is done. It is going to have consequences. Those consequences are going to multiply into more consequences. You can say you're sorry, or you can try to do other actions to try to contain the consequences that follow from your actions, right? But you can't undo action. Similarly, you can't completely predict the consequences of your actions or anybody else's actions. Let's say, for example, that our government decides to raise taxes for the middle class. Can we know what kind of consequences that's going to have in 30 years? Hell no. But presumably it's going to impact, right, how society evolves and what the future is going to be like. So we can't completely predict what our actions are going to result in. We can't know ahead of time how they're going to impact people, how they're going to change the world. Whenever we act, we initiate a process that is going to produce consequences that are going to multiply into the future that we cannot completely control, predict, or understand. That deeds possess such an enormous capacity for endurance, superior to every other man-made product, could be a matter of pride if men were able to bear its burden, the burden of irreversibility and unpredictability, from which the action process draws its very strength. That this is impossible, men have always known. They have known that he who acts never quite knows what he is doing, that he always becomes guilty of consequences he never intended or even foresaw, that no matter how disastrous and unexpected the consequences of his deed, he can never undo it, that the process he starts is never consummated unequivocally in one single deed or event, and that its very meaning never discloses itself to the actor, but only to the backward glance of the historian, who himself does not act. So this is something that we have always had an intuitive understanding of, even if your parents or your educators, your professors never explicitly told you this, right? Through your experiences, you know that when you act, shit is going to happen. And stuff is going to happen that you didn't foresee, that you didn't intend, right? That you didn't predict. This is something we already all know and understand. The problem is this places a very heavy burden on us. Because try as we might to shape the world in the image of our choice, the way that we want it to be, we don't have the knowledge or power to do that successfully. At least not completely successfully, right? Maybe we can change the world in small ways that we want it to be changed, but neither of us has complete control over everything. Neither of us has the knowledge or wisdom to control all of this stuff, to make everything the way that we want it to be. The fact of the matter is, our actions produce consequences for ourselves and others. Oftentimes, bad consequences. And that sucks. And that's something that we need to deal with, or find a way of dealing with. Thus, all this is reason enough to turn away with despair from the realm of human affairs, and to hold in contempt the human capacity for freedom, which, by producing the web of human relationships, seems to entangle its producer to such an extent that he appears much more the victim and the sufferer than the author and doer of what he has done. Nowhere, in other words, neither in labor, subject to the necessity of life, nor in fabrication, building things, products, dependent upon given material, does man appear to be less free than in those capacities whose very essence is freedom, and in that realm which owes its existence to nobody and nothing but man. So what she's saying here is, because we cannot predict the consequences of our actions, because we are always guilty of things we didn't intend to do, that we couldn't foresee, because we harm others with our actions, because we make society worse in ways that we don't mean to, that places a very heavy burden on us. When you reflect deeply on all of this, it might be enough to make you despair and say, well, maybe I should just stop acting altogether. Because I'm sick of hurting myself, I'm sick of hurting others. Am I even making things better through my actions, or am I making all of this worse? How could I ever know? Maybe that despair would be enough to drive you away from engaging in action and the archetypal form of action, politics. After all, have you always supported the right political candidate or platform? Are you proud of every political decision or protest or vote that you have cast? And these things have a real effect on what all of this is like, right? And how all of this goes. Who we elect determines the kind of policies and laws that we have. Who we support is going to influence how our society evolves, whether or not justice is established, whether or not things get easier or harder for us socially and economically.
This seems a very pessimistic viewpoint.
Just wait. Yes, it does seem pessimistic, right?
Glass half full, glass half empty.
I'm here to tell you, though, that although, yes, we cannot foresee, predict, or control all of the consequences of our actions, not all hope is lost. And this is one of the big things that Arendt is going to try to convince us of in the other two sections that we're looking at today. On account of all of what Arendt has presented to us, it might cause us to despair, to think of life as being, somewhat absurd and random, uncontrollable. That we are actually unfree. That we are constantly having to deal with the consequences of people's actions. That we are the victim and the sufferer of these forces and these events outside of our control. That maybe we should just give it all up and spend the rest of our lives watching our TikToks in our parents' basement. But Arendt doesn't think that we should despair. Arendt doesn't think that we should see ourselves as the eternal victims of these forces and processes and events outside of our control. We are not unfree. We are not condemned to just deal with all of this in a reactive way, to constantly be assaulted by all of this, to have our dreams and goals undermined. No. She says that the seeds of remedying the consequences of our actions are found within the capacity for action itself. We already have the tools, in other words, by which to release people from the consequences of their actions and provide some sort of security and promise for the future. Thus, humans have two tools available to them that I think we should probably rely on if we're going to see ourselves through, if we're going to provide some security to human life, if we are going to help establish peace for others and ourselves. Arendt says, the case of action and action's predicaments is altogether different. Here, the remedy against the irreversibility and unpredictability of the process started by acting does not arise out of another and possibly higher faculty, but is one of the potentialities of action itself. The possible redemption from the predicament of irreversibility, of being unable to undo what one has done, though one did not and could not have known what he was doing, is the faculty of forgiving. The remedy for unpredictability, for the chaotic uncertainty of the future, is contained in the faculty to make and keep promises. So, the two faculties belong together insofar as one of them, forgiving, serves to undo the deeds of the past, whose sins hang like Damocles' sword over every new generation. And the other, binding oneself through promises, serves to set up in the ocean of uncertainty, which the future is by definition, islands of security, without which not even continuity, let alone durability of any kind, would be possible in the relationships between men. So, what can we use in order to release people from the unpredictable, uncontrollable, unforeseeable consequences of their actions? Forgiveness. Forgiveness practiced toward self and other. And now that we are in a social and political situation in which there is a lot of uncertainty, in which we have these technologies and these powers that are immense, what can we do to establish some security, some certainty? We can make and keep our word. These things seem like trivial practices, but Arendt is going to say using and relying on these is going to be necessary if we're going to handle all of this stuff and if we're going to get through all of this together. She claims that Jesus of Nazareth was the first person to popularize the practice of forgiveness. A practice which she thinks is going to be necessary for us to use in order to, give some people the peace and security that they are longing for, though they do things that they do not understand and that they do not know, much as we do, right? She says only forgiveness allows us to be free to perform new actions and to start anew, to release us humans from the consequences of our actions. Although we go on acting, doing things in our daily life all the time without thinking about it, intuitively, we grasp the power of forgiveness. We do things all the time that we do not understand. We do not know how it's going to impact other people exactly. Other people are doing the same thing. We can't go through life without acting, right? Without saying things, without moving, without picking things up, writing things, all of this stuff. Thus, in our lives, on account of the fact that we need to act in order to survive, in order to keep up our relationships, in order to keep all the lights on and keep all this together, we're going to end up doing things that we don't intend. We're going to end up hurting people. We're going to end up making life worse for people. Maybe it's our family members, strangers, our friends, our classmates. And other people are going to do that to us. Right? I'm sure there are a lot of things that you've had to suffer in your life due to the actions of your friends and family members. Ways that they've hurt you, lied to you, harmed you. I'm sure you've hurt, harmed, and lied to other people in your life. Because we act and because our actions produce consequences, and because we are aware somewhat of the consequences that pop up, we carry that hurt with us that other people cause and that we cause other people, right? What does forgiveness allow us to do? It allows us to release other people from that anxiety and that despair, from the knowledge that they have harmed and hurt others. And forgiveness directed at us allows us to let go of that stuff as well, to move on, to tackle the world with a better outlook, a new way of thinking and being. Forgiveness, she says, is the opposite of vengeance, which only produces more and more consequences. Think about it. Somebody harms your brother, and so what do you want to do? Well, you want to get back at them, so you're going to harm their brother. That just produces a never-ending cycle of hurt and retaliation, right? Vengeance leads to retaliation, which leads to retaliation, which leads to more hurt and pain. In some real sense, forgiveness, at least psychologically, puts a stop to what we initiate through our actions. And it helps people cultivate some sort of psychological peace and security. She says that forgiveness, when we use it, when we give it, is usually done for the other person. And what she means by that is forgiveness, although it can have an effect on our own emotional and psychological state when we give it, right? Because insofar as we are forgiving, we are also letting go of something. Forgiveness primarily is done for the sake of releasing those chains that have been placed on the other person through their own actions, through their own consciousness, right? Beating themselves up over what they have done. Forgiveness, practicing it is going to allow us to see people for the unique subjectivities that they are, not merely the product of the actions that they have committed. Have any of you lied in here? Hold your hand up if you lied. Are all of you liars? Would you call yourself a liar? Raise your hand if you've done bad things in your life. Have you done bad things? Are you a bad person? Arendt is going to say no. Just because you've done bad things, that does not mean you're a bad person. Looking at the world through the lens of forgiveness allows us to see and recognize that. That, look, yes, we do good things and we do bad things. But our skin color, our actions, our beliefs, they don't define or capture this thing that we ultimately are. They describe what we are, but they don't capture us. Do you kind of understand what I'm trying to say? I can apply any term or category to you, but that is never going to capture you. It's never going to define you. Because in some sense, as a human being with a consciousness, with a will, you are greater and more than that. You're greater and more than just the sum of your actions or the labels, the categories that I impose on you. When we forgive, we are respecting the other person in some fundamental sense. We are being receptive to this idea that redemption is possible, that change is possible, that positive, moral and psychological development is possible. Perhaps what we can take from her analysis of forgiveness here is this idea that we should never give up on these things being possible. And insofar as we do things all the time that harm others, that we don't intend, we should also recognize that about other people as well. So, forgiveness. Forgiveness is going to be critically important in order to see us all through, in order to maintain our relationships, in order to maintain our psychological health and others' psychological health. But there's one other thing that we can do. In light of this crazy time that we find ourselves, this storm of historical events and activism and policy and all these economic processes, there's another practice that we can engage in to insulate ourselves from the uncertainty of life and the uncertainty of other people's actions. And that is promise making. This is something that has been with us for thousands of years. I know when you think of making a promise to someone, you think of, you're like sitting right next to the other person and maybe you're saying it in a hushed tone and you're like, I promise I'm going to do this. But Arendt is talking about something more general here. She's talking also about contracts, agreements. When you give your word to someone that you are going to do a thing and you say, I'm going to do this. This is what I'm going to do. You can rely on that. This is something that has been integral to the success of human societies for forever, right? In families. If we're not able to trust anybody else's word, how are we going to be able to get anything done? How are we going to be able to keep the lights on or do any of this stuff? Right? So we can give our word to people, and we can follow through on that. Doing so is going to allow us to cultivate some sort of certainty and security in this crazy society and universe in which we live, in which chaos and unpredictability swirls around us. But this will allow us to, she says, produce islands of security in this ocean of uncertainty. Promise making dispels two kinds of unpredictability when it comes to human action. The unpredictability that's associated with human nature and the unpredictability that's associated with the consequences of our actions. See, even though you have really close relationships with people, your friends, your family members, your girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever, they can still surprise you, right? They can do things that you don't expect. They have a free will. They could do something completely out of character, right? If that's true, think about how unpredictable other people are that you don't know, right? That you don't spend time with, the strangers out on the street, or the politicians. You don't know their personal lives or what's going through their heads. Humans are by nature unpredictable. So what does promise making allow us to do? It allows us to establish some predictability and security in human life. Others can give us their word. We can give others our word. That allows us to rely on each other, to trust each other, to cooperate and get things done. So promise making is a bulwark against not only the unpredictability of human nature, but also the unpredictability of the consequences of our actions. Because again, we cannot completely know or control or predict what's going to happen as the result of our actions or other people's actions. But promise making would allow us to act in a particular way in which people can predict our actions because we've told them, right, what we're going to do. Others have told us what they're going to do. So this practice of promise making is not something that is separate from human society, trivial, unimportant. It forms the bedrock of all social relationships. Where would our society be without promises, contracts, agreements between people? Right? Without people giving their word. No business deals would ever get done. Right? No plans would ever be made. No cooperation would be possible. Unless we are able to communicate in a way that we can trust and rely on. This is what she's talking about. And she says moral precepts themselves arise directly out of the will to live together with others in the mode of acting and speaking. So these two tools that we have at our disposal, forgiveness and promise making, are going to be critical, not only for our individual relationships, but also for the functioning of society as a whole. And, more specifically, the project of ethics, right? Because you're going to do things that hurt others. They're going to do things that hurt you. What kind of lives could we lead if everybody just held on to that stuff all the time? Never let it go. Never forgive another person. What kind of lives could we live? What could we actually get done and do if nobody trusted anybody else? If we never made any agreements? If we never kept our word or our promises? And so the reason why we're ending with this in this ethics class is because I think what Arendt provides here is a very useful and helpful description of the importance of not only ethical behavior, but also how we can usefully respond to the behavior of other people. What we can do to make life better for others, to move society in the right direction, the proper ways that we can respond to being hurt, to being harmed. None of this is going to be easy. Okay? Forgiving other people is not easy. Nor is keeping your word. That can be a very difficult thing to do. Right? But if Arendt is to be believed, our human life is not going to be able to be happy and successful without this stuff. Insofar as we live in a society in which their actions impact us and ours impact them. She says, without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover. We would remain the victims of its consequences forever, not unlike the sorcerer's apprentice who lacked the magic formula to break the spell. Without being bound to the fulfillment of promises, we would never be able to keep our identities. We would be condemned to wander helplessly and without direction in the darkness of each man's lonely heart. caught in its contradictions and equivocalities. A darkness which only the light shed over the public realm through the presence of others who confirm the identity between the one who promises and the one who fulfills can dispel. Both faculties, therefore, forgiveness and promise-making, depend on plurality, on the presence and acting of others. For no one can forgive himself, and no one can be bound by a promise made only to himself. Forgiving and promising enacted in solitude or isolation remain without reality between people and can signify no more than a role played before oneself. So, this is the only time in class that I'm going to try to convince you of something. I would like to convince you now that forgiveness and promise-making should be an integral part of your life. God knows you're not perfect. I'm not perfect. All the ethical theories and issues that we've discussed, sure, it's given you a lot of knowledge of this stuff, perhaps. Maybe we should call them perspectives, because who the hell knows what's right? The fact remains, even with all this stuff, even with everything that we've looked at, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to hurt strangers. We're going to hurt people who are closest to us. Those whom we profess to love more than anybody else. If we're going to heal, if we're going to help others heal, we should learn to forgive. And if we're going to try to establish some security, some peace and reliability and trust between each other, we need to keep our word to each other. And so what I think Arendt is trying to get at this part in the book, is that if we're going to make it through all of the difficulties and events that we're going through right now, if our relationships are going to be maintained, if society is going to continue to function well enough, we need to forgive and we need to keep our word. Without doing these things, it's not likely that we'll make it very far, that we will experience healing, that others will experience healing, that we'll be able to deal with other nations when it comes to international politics, geopolitics. Can you imagine the kinds of mess we would be in if every other country lied about everything it was doing and was going to do to everybody else? That's a straight path to mutual destruction, it seems to me. And so part of our lives should be not only trying to be a moral and a fulfilled person, but also somebody who seeks to atone not only for their actions, their sins, if you'd like to use some religious language, but also who tries to help others as well. If we're going to engage in ethical behavior, that must include forgiveness and promise-making. Because without it, I think we would all fall into lives filled with resentment, despair, scarification, trauma, etc. I'm not telling you to forgive any particular person. But I am trying to impress upon you the power and importance of forgiveness in your relationships. It's going to be up to you to decide who you forgive, who you don't forgive, who you make promises to, whether or not you're going to keep your word at all. But before you write this stuff off or just accept it wholeheartedly, really think about the kind of life that you want to live. Think about the kind of society that is going to result from people not doing this and from people doing this. And maybe those competing images will help you decide how it is you want to think and behave, whether you want to forgive or not. So I'll leave you with just a few questions to consider. Do you agree with Arendt that forgiveness and promise making are good things and that we should practice them now that you've taken a whole class on ethics? Do you think that these things are going to be necessary for the functioning of society now and into the future? If that doesn't get you thinking, think about your own personal relationships. How would your relationships be if those people never forgave you, if they never kept their word? How would your relationships be if you never forgave them or ever kept your word? These are things that you should spend some time reflecting on. So what do y'all think? Does this make sense? Is it more hopeful than pessimistic?
The beginning was very pessimistic.
So it ended well,
Yeah,
you might say? Okay, good.
It was a fun journey.
Thoughts on this? Or are you all just ready to... Yeah.
I think this is much better than the previous topic we covered last class.
Okay. Why? Why do you like this one?
But because it just, so the previous theory, just was completely pessimistic all in itself.
Sure.
We ought to, life is full of suffering, and we ought to just let our thoughts die out.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
But this one here says that we can overcome some of the issues we face. Right? If we do wrong to other people, or if somebody wrongs us, right, we can forgive one another.
Yeah. Yeah. What is implied in this view is perhaps not only that human life is worth it, but also that we can ameliorate a lot of the suffering that we and others experience by engaging in these practices. Yeah. It's not all doom and gloom. It's hopeful,
I think it's very profound coming from her after seeing the rise of Nazism and going through all of that herself.
Right. Somebody who was persecuted as a Jew, yeah.
I don't know how much she went through, but it makes it more profound coming from someone who's went through that type of suffering, or has family or friends that went through that type of suffering.
Right. You're absolutely correct. Anne Arendt was somebody whose one of the primary love interests of her life actually was a Nazi and provided support for the Nazi Party. So.
One of the people that you would think would never be able to forgive some of the atrocities that maybe we shouldn't forgive.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
was able to write about forgiveness.
Right. Exactly. Somebody who has had some of the discriminatory and oppressive experiences that we have not in our lives, right, is saying this. Maybe that means something. Maybe that means we should reflect on it and recognize its power and profundity. Any other questions, concerns, comments? No? Okay. All right, well, I will end it there. I hope you all found this interesting and enlightening. Please think about it. Think about what Arendt is saying here, whether you agree with it, whether or not you think it's good.